Okay, today I'm here with a really fascinating guy. David Prescott is with me, and if you don't know David, this is a guy that you definitely want to check out. He's been in this business over, 36 years, which David just means you're old. And
Yes.
he's the editor of Safer Society Press, and he's also been an author, co-author, and editor of over 20 different books. He's been the 2014 recipient of the Distinguished Contribution Award from the Association of the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, and recently in 2018, he received the C. Henry Kemp Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Adolescent Perpetuation Network. He's an expert in treating sexual violence and trauma, and he's an expert also in outcomes, and that's something I'm always interested in. So, David, thanks so much for joining me today.
All right. Thanks for letting me be here.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, I wanted to start with this idea. We briefly talked about the conditions that help create or facilitate change. And one of the books I wrote, I was a real eye opener for me to research these conditions because for years I was under that belabored belief that it was the theory or the technique. And that kind of, I think, limited me a lot. And so, I just kind of, from your perspective, because you've done quite a bit of work in this area, what are some things that you've seen, not just research wise, but also anecdotally in your work that kind of gives you a framework for this idea of what are those conditions?
Wow. That's thank you, Paul. So I could go on and on and on about this. So you may need to stop me at some point. But um, as I'm listening to the question, it's funny. The first place I went was an assistant facility director in a forensic psychiatric hospital. In a meeting at one point, he put it succinctly. He said, if you treat people like dogs, they're going to lash out like wolves. And I know that seems like a strange place to start, but of course, in the forensic arena, many people who purport to be change agents end up coming off with a certain sort of moral superiority to the
Mhm.
people that they're working with. We work with people who've committed some really serious crimes. There's no question about that. And on the other hand, if our sense of moral superiority gets in the way, change is probably not going to be possible. And as my friend and colleague Tony Ward put it, we need to stop seeing people as moral strangers and start thinking of them as fellow travelers. This kind of partnership that Bill Miller in motivational interviewing talks about, et cetera. And so, with that, I think about some of the people I've seen who've made dramatic changes in the world and or to themselves, that is, within the world, and I think about what various people have said. One person said, well, I think my clients in another forensic psychiatric institution, my clients don't change until they realize that the costs of not changing are higher than the costs of changing. Okay, so I think that's a really good point. And I have no doubt there are some people in the world that have said, I could die from my drinking. I think it's
Right.
time to get, yeah, right. This really may cost me my marriage, or I may never get out of this place, or what have you. Um, so those, so that makes a great deal of sense. But what I keep coming back to, I had my own experience in college. I don't know if anybody else ever has, but I was walking from my apartment to the campus of Syracuse University, and I found myself saying, this day is going to suck. First, I got a test, then I got this class that I'm not doing so well in. And I suddenly had this brainwave. Why am I thinking so negatively? I said, for all you know, it could turn out to be Christmas. You could ace the test, and your professor might actually find something good inside of you. you know, this kind of thing. And what do you know? Long before I ever knew it, I was doing cognitive therapy on myself,
Mhm.
and I imagine that a lot of people have done this. Then last thing before I see if I'm making sense is there was a book that just came out called, I think it's The Mind Fixers. Have you seen this? It's a history of psychiatry.
I think I've heard of it, but I have not
Yeah.
read it.
Oh, it's worth a read. Just don't get bogged down in the chapter about lobotomies because it's pretty depressing. But history of psychiatry. And in the introduction, one of the points that the guy makes is we should all be doing therapy as well as our grandmothers did. Because
Ah,
maybe what the world needs more of, at least this is what my wife believes, is more grandmothers.
yeah.
So how do we do it? 36 years of practice, Paul, I've come back to it really is ultimately about the relationship.
Yes.
And then once you have that relationship, do you have some shared understanding of the goals? This is
Hmm.
the Edward Borden Therapeutic Alliance. And is your approach a good fit? And do you guys have agreement on the relationship that you have? Because my relationship to my clients is going to be different from somebody else's, etc. It's amazing to me how I guess Bruce Wampold and Zach Imel said it. I hope I'm saying his name right. Said it perfectly in the introduction to their 2015 book. They said it's amazing that the one of the most effective interventions is the most low-tech intervention of all, the
Hmm.
human conversation.
Hmm.
So ultimately, it's about understanding otherness or respecting otherness in the present moment.
Hmm.
Is that a good place to?
That's great to jump in because I tell you that term that you use, I want to go a little deeper on moral superiority.
Ooh,
And of
yeah.
course, you were also talking about the idea, dealing with a lot of population that you've worked with in the past with perpetrators, criminal issues, forensic. But that is obviously, as you well know, pretty rampant in just the general population we deal with. Is that oftentimes, and I'm going to just be honest here, I've been guilty of this in the past, time and time again, was taking a moral superiority, not so much as in viewing people as morally bankrupt, but thinking my ideas, my way of seeing things is so much better than the clients. Now, of course, we can say, well, obviously, if their life's a train wreck, some of their ideas aren't that great. But I think in some ways it's still maybe a holdover from the early days of our field to where most of the time your therapist was a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, or the early days of psychology, and they're doctors, and you follow the doctor's directive, and the doctor always knows best. And then you may have to badger the person to take on your point of view, which you and I both know that is a very limiting result. So, having said that, what do you kind of feel are the best remedies for somebody who recognizes, ooh, I've been doing a little bit of this moral superiority, and how do I become more cognizant of it and change that?
Wow. Well, I just had about three things go flash before my eyes. One of them is there's a YouTube video of Viktor Frankl. And after making this wonderful joke, he says, I can speak perfect accent without a hint of English, which is kind of funny. He then says in that accent of his, what you have to do is when you hold somebody this high, when you elevate them, then you elevate them to what they can be. And I always thought, now that's really something.
Hmm.
This idea of can you take somebody who's in prison garb, has committed a terrible crime, and look at them truly as having something to offer the world over and above their own awareness and most definitely above your own.
Hmm.
That might be one place to start. And as far as I'm concerned, that is a practice skill since the clients I work with don't tend to have many skills at making themselves look lovable. Um,
Yes.
so that piece takes a little while. I don't mean that negatively. Bill Miller has also talked in motivational interviewing about having to take a sort of socially submissive one down perspective and say, you really have to be, if you're going to truly join up with somebody and offer ways that life might be different, then you sort of have to take this one down kind of approach. The third one will come to me in just a moment. It's eluding me right now. But this idea for me about partnership, oh, I remember the third one was the classic study that sometimes, well, it frequently gets misunderstood. You must know this one by Steve Walfish and his colleagues in
Right.
2012 on self-assessment bias.
Self-assessment. Right. Right. Yeah.
And the idea being the average therapist thought that they were better than 80% of their peers.
Yeah.
Holy wow. So what I've found is I want to be like those people that don't think they're so great. And watch out, because I'm going to name names here. If you've ever met, like, for example, Birgit Vala in Norway, she's produced extremely important and great outcomes across the course of her career, and you would not know it to meet with her.
Hmm.
But you would if you meet Birgit, you know immediately you could talk to her. And another person is Wendy Amy in the UK, the
Right.
famous Wendy,
Yeah.
who has been very clear with me any number of times and says, David, I do not deserve my reputation. Unless I'm getting feedback, I really will be more, wrong more often than I'm right. So she sees herself as she's one of those below average people. So tying those threads together, I guess for me means we need to be humble. And in my field, unless you're humble about your abilities, public safety is at stake.
Hmm.
If you're thinking, oh, a Facebook meme I saw recently, I can tell if somebody's going to be judgmental before they even open their mouth. Yeah, yeah, it's a little ironic. But I think when we get caught in that trap, so then, Paul, last thing I'll say is, how do we get to that place in our lives where we really can be that humble?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, and I've certainly had my own moral superiority earlier in my career. I guess it's just practice. For
Hmm.
me, it's practice. For others, it must come more naturally.
And it's a,
Yeah,
I think it's a, kind of a tightrope one has to walk, having therapeutic humility, but also having confidence, and knowing that, I know my stuff, or, I can create change, or at least help facilitate it, because, and we're not a world, human nature, I don't think is a world of good in the middle. We tend to go to extremes. Uh, and there's some element, though, if
yeah,
you think back, and I won't name names, of many people throughout our history who were incredibly self-centered, but incredibly charismatic, and were able to accomplish a lot of incredible outcomes in some areas. But it's like when they struck, like they're playing baseball, they either hit an absolute home run that Babe Ruth would be, just applauding, or they were struck out. So it's like they were never able. So you have this whole group of people who they weren't able to help, but the ones they do, which made the books, you marvel, oh my God, what a genius, and they were, but because they did not have that humility, that group that maybe they could have had even better outcomes. I wonder sometimes having therapeutic humility might have helped them become even more amazing than possibly they already were. I'm
yeah,
reminded of one of my heroes, Milton Erickson, who I believe in the end didn't really care whether the client knew that he was responsible or what, and was happy that they went off thinking they wasted money, even though these change happened, because he was more concerned about the outcome, you know?
yeah, yeah, yeah. To that, I heard a therapist once say, "Just one day a year, can't I take the responsibility for client success?
Yeah,
Can't I, or the credit? That's what I meant to.
yeah, yeah,
Just once, can't I take the credit?"
right.
I'm with Milton on that. Or imagine Steve Jobs, for example, the guy that gave us the iPhone, is certainly surrounded by any number of failures, I imagine. Some professional, some personal, I bet. I
Yeah,
don't know very much about him, but he sure did knock it out of the park on the Mac and the iPhone.
yeah, yeah, indeed. Well, if somebody were to come for you, like supervision with you, and tell you, um, I'm getting I'm getting some good outcomes, but I feel like I'm just going through the motions. Do you feel that there's some humility involved there? Like they need to be more present with their clients, or do you feel like they're maybe focusing on the wrong kind of thing?
Wow, that statement. First, I've never heard anybody say that statement, but can you imagine how many different things it might actually reflect?
Hmm.
One thing might be I just turned 50 and I'm starting to, although I'm a master craftsman, I'm starting to get bored. Do you have anything for that?
Hmm.
Or it could also be, I'm getting really good outcomes, but I'm just yearning for that next difference that makes a difference. I don't have a clue yet what it would be.
Right. Right.
So part of me is, um, one of the first places I go when I think about something like that is the incredible taxonomy that Daryl Chow and Scott Miller came up with, that looks at various elements of the 50-minute hour or what have you. How are you at opening the session, at tolerating client affect? How are you at introducing measures or changing the subject or blah, blah, blah? That might be one place to turn. I guess what I'm thinking underneath all of it is, what does this therapist aspire to? Or to put it, I forget who framed it in these words, but what makes their heart sing
Hmm.
when it comes to doing this kind of work?
Hmm. Hmm. And I think that's a tough place to be, because if what we makes us happy are the outcomes, but there's, for a lot of people, outcomes are nice, but they need a little something extra. It's like this piece of pie is great, but a little bit of whipped cream on the top would sure make it better. And I guess maybe each personality has to figure out what their whipped cream is,
Yeah,
therapeutically. So.
yeah. I know for me, and I imagine it may be similar to you, I really enjoy the company of other people that do this work.
Mhm.
Folks that kind of understand what it's all about. And, I can go back and feel as though I'm accomplishing nothing for 8 hours if I know I'm connected to others who get what that's like.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. So
That's true. That's really true. And I think I just want to say this, that I think you made a point there of connecting with others, because I think so many, particularly people in private practice, are so isolated a lot of times. And definitely right now, while we're recording this, we still have this COVID thing going on. So we're
yeah,
now getting more isolation. And I think maybe that connection with other people who get us it might be definitely helping with burnout.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Very true. Because there are days I'm just ready to get back out there.
Mhm.
I watched a movie that took place. It's a really old. I think it might have been an Alfred Hitchcock movie from the 50s. It took place. One scene took place in Havana, Cuba, and there were lots of people out shaking hands and taking pictures of themselves all standing next to each other.
Mhm.
And it was sort of like just this sort of who's who or panoply of things that nobody does these days.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Uh-huh.
neither here nor there. Hey,
Yeah.
can I ask you, Paul,
Yeah.
what would you do? Where would be the first place you would go with that supervisee that says, I'm getting good outcomes, but uh,
I think first thing I do is very similar to what you. It's like, well, what specifically are you kind of you feel you're missing, and then if they don't know, a lot of times I would ask also about their personal life, not too personal, but I find that a
sure.
lot of times when people start putting too much of themselves into their work, which I mean, totally guilty of here,
Yeah, yeah.
we tend to lose ourself, and when we start that unconscious losing ourself to our work, I know that for me that has, okay, is this it? Um, it's uh, it's like that, the magician who has done this amazing trick, but he's done it so much, and he or she's done it a million times, but there's got to be something to make it like the first time they've ever done it, and it's really hard to do that. So
Yeah.
there has to be, I think, maybe a balance, but I think that's probably where I would go, probably the same way, figuring out what is it specifically you're looking for.
And that kind of brings us, thank you, Paul. And that really brings us right back to our empathic and attuned interventions.
Right.
In that
Right.
moment, finding the fascination in every client,
Hmm.
finding some way to join up with that client and what makes them different from all the other clients you've experienced,
Right.
etc.
Yeah, and that's tricky. I think because particularly like in the work that a lot of you've done, you start hearing the same kind of story, and I think that's why it's, I think, important, particularly as we're talking about these conditions for change. If we fall back into, well, I've heard this story before, and then automatically assuming that all the actors in the play are going to do the same as the last play. Because I don't know if you've ever seen a play, or we'll just say a movie, a remake of a movie. And I happened to watch a remake of one of my favorite movies, and the whole time I'm going like, the script's close to the same, but this is totally different. But the story was still the same for the most part. And I think that if we're just assuming that the story's always going to be and the players are the same, I think it's, for all of us, it's easy to kind of get stuck.
Wow. Wow. Sort of like bands that do covers. At what
Yeah,
point do you
yeah,
breathe your own originality into it,
yeah.
and what have you? Yeah. It's it's a lot of work being a therapist, isn't it?
Hmm.
And these are things that a lot of us don't think about out in the rest of society. Um, I've just been on a listserv discussion where people are saying we need to make this list safer for our Black and Indigenous and other people of color, and so on. And that, for many people, what that means is we need to call out whiteness and white supremacy and racism wherever we see it, which is all good. You know, I'm down with all of that. However, it's just striking to me the tone that people are taking about this. It's actually making this listserv, in my estimation, quite a bit less safe for people to participate in, because the belief that we all need to call one another out seems to come with it an implicit assumption that we're all right, and or that we're all correct and morally superior and all of these kinds of things. And it often seems to me these days that in many portions of society, we've forgotten some of those basic listening skills or conversation skills. And we've lost the ability to say that he might not have meant to say that the way it just appeared to me. And sometimes, a lot of times, microaggressions are microaggressions. I got that. Absolutely. And on the other hand, it's strange how we haven't learned from the lessons of the past either. The discussion actually went and caused me to go back and reread some of Martin Luther King's writings,
Hmm.
where he was talking about the importance of love
Hmm.
and the difficulty of making it happen under many circumstances. How do you call out your colleagues when they say something microaggressively or openly racist? How do you call them? Some people have talked about we don't call out, we need to call them in. And I kind of like that a little bit better. I'm okay with protesting in the streets if it's the right thing to do under the right circumstances, but acting as though you're in a state of protest all the time seems to limit you. I don't know. These are. I hope I'm making sense, and that I'm saying this in the spirit in which it's intended. That there's many ways to have difficult conversations with people,
Hmm.
but that some of the more popular ones are also one-way tickets to really ruining a relationship.
Right. And we also have to be aware, and this is the cybernetic epistemology view of me, who's making the distinctions. And
Yeah,
if
yeah,
we automatically assume that our distinctions are factual, we can create all these higher levels of meaning that may be flawed or maybe right on the money, but just
yeah.
to say, okay, tell me more, just that, how that, tell me more about that. And my gut says that whatever's going on with this list serve that you're on, probably some of those people, when they're, I'm hoping, when they're in therapy, would probably not react that way.
I do
And
hope so.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Leading to the ultimate question. So let's say you do have a client in treatment that is displaying some kind of racist, if there is such a thing, semi-racist belief, but it's enough that it's concerning to you.
Right.
There's a real question of at what point do even the worst of the worst deserve some kind of compassion and opportunity to change?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And to what extent do people who are engaged in moral superiority or outright racism or any of these kinds of things, at what point are they also suffering
mm-hmm,
and worthy of a safe space in which to explore these kinds of things?
mm-hmm.
Just an interesting question for me.
Yeah, I think that's true because you know, again, from my perspective, and it's hard because I'm human, we have humanity and we have behaviors. And if nothing else, Carl Rogers' writings taught me that we are not our behaviors. And if we can say, you know, certain beliefs were not our beliefs. I mean, Albert Ellis worked hard to teach us we're not our beliefs. So as did the Buddha. So it's funny. Where do we get into where the humanity is? And I've had those clients of all races, by the way, who were not particularly nice people as far as racial ideas. And you know, I think this is a really a good place for maybe leaders in the field to have that discussion, because
Mm.
the second we start telling people what they should believe and what they should do, you know, are we making the problem worse? Are we opening, as you say, bring them in instead of push them out? Are we idealizing some people or some groups and demonizing others, as opposed to having a um, avoiding overgeneralizations and seeing that everybody, for the most part, now some people, I just believe, unfortunately, they're born screwed up, you know, when they come to these kind of evil, violent kind of things. But in practice, I try to always keep the mindset that no matter what you've done or what you will do, you're worthy of love. And it's hard, and you know, and you in particular know how
Yeah.
hard that is. So
Wow.
I don't know if you could speak to that, or you know.
Yeah, just that sense of yeah, are people born a certain way or what have you? You know, there has actually been some rather interesting research on the etiology of, for example, pedophilia, sexual interest in children, and these kinds of things. And you know, with some neurological studies, and all I can say is whatever the predisposing factors, I believe all human beings can change. Some of them might not ever be able to keep themselves safe in society, but all people can change, and they do all the time. And that one way to look at it is they were born this way. But for me, a more nuanced way, you mentioned Buddha earlier, might be to say, you know, one interpretation might be they're playing out some kind of karmic whatever. Or you could take a more sort of Native American indigenous approach and say this is part of their story.
Mhm.
And or you could go full blown UK with a guy named Shad Maruna. I'm hoping to attend a webinar of his tomorrow. Yeah, who said in some of his research there seems to be people um, who have something called a condemnation script. They tell themselves, "I've tried everything I could to be a different person, but nothing worked." And then there's the others who have more of a successful cognitive script that goes something like, you know, I think getting into all of that trouble and hurting people was something I actually had to go through to become the person that I am today. And I am not proud of what I've done, but I can look forward and say, I'm not that person anymore. He refers to it as cognitive transformation. So I guess maybe a practice skill for some of these difficult conversations is something to the effect of this guy is living out a story. And I don't know all the forces of the universe that have impinged on this, but I do know that there. It seems the last time I checked, there seemed to be some free will in this mix, and as soon as he's ready to make some changes in his life, he'll be able to.
Mhm.
And yeah,
And a lot of times it's just taking the responsibility, because if you are in that unfortunately pedophilia situation, if it is biological, you may have a choice still to say, I need to do what I need to do to not be in those
yes,
situations. And
you got it.
that's a
Yeah,
choice, you know, and
yeah,
that's and to me that's admirable. Anybody, it's like same thing with the alcoholic. I'm just not going to bars, or you know, it's is kind of what it is. And it's hard though when they're wearing all these disguises of dysfunction to kind of see them under it.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. And it's also tricky in my field. It's kind of tricky. I am not optimistic that somebody's sort of sexual interest repertoire is going to change very much throughout their life. conversion therapy, all of this kind of thing. I am very optimistic that people can manage their behaviors
Mm,
with respect to these kinds of things. So ultimately, it's a little bit like us. There's some people we can work with better than others, and likewise, there's some behaviors that people can engage in a little bit better than others. So for me, what I never want to say is, wow, sexual interests don't change very much across the lifespan. Research has shown this.
mm,
And by the way, the research is tenuous about that. But most of us agree, if you've got pedophilia and you really do have that, it's probably not going away. It may change its form and its expression and all of this kind of stuff, but it's probably not going away. But if you tell people this is a lifelong condition, you may actually be making matters worse by
mm,
instilling hopelessness.
mhm,
So where I try to be optimistic is around, and you know what, you can change your behaviors quite easily. And this doesn't need to be a death sentence. Likewise, my friends in the substance use disorder world very often think in terms of a kind of therapeutic hospice situation, saying, you know, the person really does have a life-threatening condition. They're recovering from opioid addiction.
mhm,
The numbers aren't great in their favor, and so what we try to do instead of telling them how they should behave or what they should be thinking or let go and let God or making other kinds of demands like this, instead we're treating it like hospice, where you go and everybody's nice to you. And ultimately, this is a decision that only you can make for yourself. And
mhm.
returning back to an earlier point of yours, I may be the expert in my field, but only you are the expert on you.
Yeah.
And if and when you become ready to make a change in this area, and when you really dig in deep with it, let me tell you, I don't think anything will be able to stop you once you get going.
Mhm.
This kind of thing. But on the other hand, Lord knows, I am not the person that makes people change.
Right, right. Yeah. Well, I think that's probably a good place to stop because I think there's
Yeah.
just that last minute. I think there's a lot of profound views of just working with people in general. Um, the last question, though, I do have for you
Yeah.
is if you had to go back in time to David, at whatever age you started this journey, since you've been at this for over 36 years, you obviously started when you were two.
Yeah. Yes,
Um,
right.
what was the one thing you'd want him to know after, with all this that you know now with clinical experience and also your research?
Stay deep. Um, when I was a teenager, I started reading the works of Carl Jung.
Mm,
And I actually read a good chunk of Freud's interpretation of dreams.
mm,
And lots to say about that. But I found that stuff fascinating. And then I went to school, and then I got into my first jobs, and I had supervisors that were quite demanding that I abandon anything like a worldview that was influenced by those authors. All these years later, I guess my message back to myself then would be, you can drive it underground, but don't make it go away.
yeah.
Sort of like psychotherapy in Behind the Iron Curtain,
Hmm.
where they said you have to talk like Pavlov but think like Freud.
Hmm. Hmm.
So maybe it would have been something like that. If I could just say one more thing,
Sure.
I just want to clarify, when we talk about the protests and the racism and stuff like that that seems to be endemic in society these days, I'm not belittling or minimizing it in any way. And certainly 36 years of experience of noticing the subtly different ways that I interact with people who are, um, not from my background, and even within the white community, if you will. That's a terrible phrase, but I remember from moving out to the Midwest, the upper Midwest, there's a lot of who I am that these other white people couldn't ever relate to,
Hmm.
because I was out there in the land of white people, let me tell you,
Yeah.
if you've ever
Yeah.
been to Wisconsin. So I mean, I have friends who are suffering and struggling through a lot of this, but I am talking about the kindness and charity that all humans can bring to the table. So thanks for letting me say that.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I really appreciate you talking to me today. And I think the work you're doing, the research you're doing, I think it's going to continue to make our field a little more productive, but also more responsible. And I think that's important.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Paul. I really appreciate it. And always great catching up with you and getting a window into your work as well.
Mm. Good. Thanks,
So.
man.